Hello, everybody, and welcome to the channel. Today, I'm privileged to be joined by Daniel Mersey, a fantastic author and games designer. So, Daniel, it's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite.
There's a lot to go through. A big chunk of several of my shelves have got your name branded across them. But before we get into what you've been getting up to, I think it'd be interesting to find out sort of where you came from and how you got started in wargaming as a hobby.
Okay, well, I was always very interested in military stuff. Being a kid in the late 1970s, my dad had a huge stack of Military Modelling magazine, which back in the day it started as model kits and model soldiers, and then wargaming kind of took it over. So as I was looking through the magazines as a kid, I was kind of looking at these things and thinking, wow, I can play with it. I don't just need to sit and make the models with my dad. I can actually do things with them as well. And then early 80s, I discovered fighting fantasy game books, and then Dungeons and Dragons, Dragon Warriors, one of the first British role-playing games, and kind of went off into fantasy role-playing for a while. But then over time, I'd always been really interested in history. So I found myself coming back to historical gaming in probably the late 80s when I was, I don't know, probably about 12 or 13, something like that. And it's kind of just always been there. It bubbles away as one of my hobbies. And I think that's something that's quite important to me. Although I've written lots of games and been quite involved in lots of different things in the gaming industry, everything I do is still a hobby to me. I'm not doing it because I'm certainly not a huge corporation myself or anything like that. I do it because I enjoy it. And that's where any of the games that I work on or the miniatures range, anything like that, it all comes from what I enjoy doing and what I want to do. So it's kind of it's stuck with me from when I was a little kid right the way through to now, as I'm an aging man with no hair. And yeah, I've just always been interested in role playing, board games, miniatures games, kind of any kind of tactile game, really.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because it's your hobby and you do it for fun. Do you still get a chance to game a lot? Because I'll often get a chance to sit down and talk to designers and people in the industry in various aspects, and they go, I don't really have time for gaming, or the game I'm writing is the game I'm playing, and once that's written and I have to move on to the next one, that will be what I'm doing. And it seems like it's one of those never let your hobby become your work, because then it separates you from what you found fun about it to begin with. Or do you fall into that camp, or do you still find time to play things that you're not working on and other genres and games?
It depends. For miniatures, as that's what most of the games I work on myself are, it does generally come down to whatever I'm working on as my next game is what I'm spending my time playing. But at the same time, I'm not always working on a new game. So I do get time to play a few games. I don't tend to play so many of my own ones. Right. I play them to death when I'm developing them. And after that, I still return to them from time to time, but it's not like I just sit and play my own games or anything like that. But away from miniatures, I still regularly role play. And I used to have a great board gaming group that I was part of, but we've kind of all gone in different directions over the years. So we rarely get together now. And post pandemic, or during the pandemic, we picked up role playing again by Zoom and using Facebook and things like that. And that kind of meant we found ourselves playing fewer board games and more role playing games because we could do it virtually. So yeah, it kind of depends on what I'm working on myself at the time. But I love gaming, so I try to do it as often as I can. But probably like everyone, I don't do as much as I'd like.
It's the curse of growing older, I suppose. It's life starts to get in the way of our fun times. So moving into the game design then, you've obviously done a large swathe of games that run the gamut from ancients through to, I suppose, 17th, 18th century. Is there any particular genre or period that really stands out to you? Because one of the things that I noticed recurring multiple times, and maybe it's just a line in a book, but Arthur, the Arthurian legends and that period just seems to crop up in several of them.
Yeah, I mean, that's really where I got started in creating my own games. It was, well, at university, I studied archaeology and specialised in the post-Roman British period. And for my very first game, Glutter of Ravens, which was 1998, I think, I'd realised after I finished my degree that I had all of this information that was far more up to date than anything you ever read in a gaming magazine, but it just wasn't kind of out there for gamers to use. So I started trying to take all of the elements of the research I'd done and what I discovered on my degree that were going to be of use to gamers, and write them up into a source book and a rule set as well. But yeah, I mean, that's probably the period of history that fascinates me the most. So over the years, I've written Glutter of Ravens, Song of Arthur and Merlin, Dux Bellorum, Age of Penda, and now the second edition of Lion Rampant kind of moves the period back to include Dark Ages as well.
It swells and expands to encompass a larger period, which makes sense when you think about the technology, if not the application. A sword or a spear pretty much function the same way, whether it's 300 BC or 1400 AD. BCE, if you're more up to date. So yeah, it's nice to see. I suppose we'll talk about the massive line in the room. 8 years ago, you published Lion Rampant, and it became a firm favourite amongst fans of the period and the scale of gaming, because it was one of the very first, I suppose, warband style games that really had traction. They've become much more prevalent almost a decade later. But so what was the idea behind revisiting it? Because a lot of rule sets are very solid, and bar some smaller errata or house rules, especially with historics, you don't really need to go back and do a second edition or revisit them. They'll stand the test of time, and Lion Rampant could have quite happily sat without ever being looked at again, and would still be played up and down well, I was going to say up and down the country, but across the world, really. So was the second edition something that you wanted to approach, or was it something that Osprey came back and asked you to have another look at? Because it's gone from one of the blue books, which, if people aren't aware, are very thin, sort of
64 pages, 22,000 words.
It's now a massive tome with a lovely hardback and a spectacular cover art, as you can see behind
lovely,
Daniel.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
you can see projecting out of my ears.
It's the way to go.
Just to pick up on one of the points you made there about the kind of warband scale games. The first one that I remember getting very popular was probably Saga, which I think came out in 2011 or 2012. Now, my original Lion Rampant, I'd actually had around as a game for years. Never did anything with, because I thought, if I'm honest, I thought it was probably too simple a game for most gamers to like. I mean, remember, this was kind of early 2000s was when I'd worked on that. And I think games were generally a bit chunkier at the time. There was a bit more depth in terms of what you had to learn to play the game. And then in 2012, Dux Bellorum came out, which was the first of the blue books, which was my Arthurian game. And so that's actually this month in August 2022. That's actually 10 years old this month. So that's when the range launched. After that book had come out, it had been quite successful, and Osprey asked if I had any other games that were ready to go. And I sort of kind of apologetically showed them Lion Rampant and said, well, look, I've got this. I don't think it's are people going to play this? I love it. It's my level of game, but I don't know if anyone else will. And they kind of looked at me and went, oh, yeah, well, we'd like to do that. So it kind of surprised me how popular that did go on to become. And for the second edition, I mean, we've worked on that over the past couple of years, I would say. And the initial conversation was quite a short one in as much as Osprey said to me, would you like to produce a second edition of Lion Rampant? And I said no. Because I think the game works. I'm not really interested in producing a new edition of a book just for the
sake of it,
the sake of it, and for extra sales or anything like that. But then they expanded on the idea and were explaining to me, that I don't have to change it, because I was very keen not to really change the rules. I think they work. As anyone that has a second edition will see, there's a section in there showing exactly what's changed. And it's really not very much when it comes to the battle rules, but the expanded page extent has allowed me to add loads more detail. So some of that comes from things that I've worked on over the past 8 years, either that have come through in magazine articles or just additional things I've been doing with the game. It allowed me as well to just address a few of the areas that I've seen online that people are either confused by or didn't especially like. So there are a couple of places where I've given alternative rules you can try. But really it was the extra page count meant I could add lots of additional detail, add a few more scenarios, but without changing the original rules. My whole thing of doing it was I didn't want someone that had purchased the first edition to feel like they had to get the second edition to continue playing, because I'm a gamer and I don't like it if that's happened to me with other rules. I'll quite often just stick with my original one that I was using for however many years, and I don't want anyone to feel like they have to buy. Obviously, I like it if they do.
And I'm with you on that, because you very consciously, and I think it was sort of spread all over the internet that nobody's current warband or how you play would be rendered obsolete or changed by it.
That was very.
And if you've spent, in my case, years painstakingly trying to get something painted, and then when you finally do get it finished, somebody comes in with a new edition and you discover that the points have been halved or doubled or something's changed like that, and all of a sudden you end up having to go back and revisit the force that you're using, you will either stick with the first edition or just throw the head up, I suppose, is the other way of looking at it. But I have to say I was very impressed.
I was just going to say that's really the whole thing with Lion Rampant. It was just giving me the opportunity to add some extra detail that I just didn't have space for in the first edition, but also to expand it based on how I knew people were using the game. Like, say, expanding it backwards to kind of like the fall of Rome. I knew that a lot of people were already using the rules in that way, so I've just been able to add a few extra bits to give people all of the resources they need to do that.
And the second half of the book, apart from the army list themselves, is a very substantial amount of scenarios. I want to say there's 14 scenarios in there.
I think it's 16, but 16. I'm not sure.
It's a substantial amount of scenarios, regardless. And then the campaign system. And I really like the campaign system, simply because of I've often played some games where you try and do something like that, and it gets a bit cumbersome with bookkeeping, but having a setup where you have essentially 5 warbands aside in your little mini campaign, and it's up to you where you're deploying them and how you're using them. So they may or may not come up against a larger force, and then having the sort of grid or table showing the results and how they will play out and affect your campaign. I really like that. It's a nice, meaty narrative campaign that you can really build upon with your group without having to go through pages and pages of bookkeeping and documentation. It's very self-contained, and if anybody is interested in running campaigns, this is a really nice one to have access to.
I would say that it's really I suppose my design ethos on pretty much everything I do is to try to streamline things, not to the point where it's oversimplified or that there's no history peeking through behind it. I still feel like I'm doing a medieval game or 19th century game. There needs to be enough in there so that you feel like you're playing a game set in that period, which kind of matches up well enough against what you can read in history books or accounts of battles. But at the same time, it's a big part of my design process is I build up a game, the game that I want to see happen, and then I'll strip it back. So I'll be looking at it in terms of, is this needed? Is there a more streamlined way to do it? Because I'm very conscious none of us really seem to have the time to play games in the way we would like to. So I'm trying to balance giving the best possible experience that you can have playing a game or playing a campaign against actually being able to do it.
Yeah,
you can sit down and play one of my games in 1 or 2 hours usually, and a campaign, again, you don't need to spend a huge amount of time in, if you like, in the non-gaming sense of checking what's going on in the campaign. It's really, I think of them they're linked scenarios more than a full-on campaign.
Sure.
But that's what I think works for my style of games. Really.
Yeah. And I mean, it's one of the things that sort of comes through, that it's not a full-on simulation. It's a game first and foremost, but it's a game that has the feel of the period and style of fighting that you're playing, without having to go into, have the troops clashed already this turn? Are they rested? Were they on a forced march the night before? And so, which some of the more in-depth, well, certainly the ones I started with, probably less so these days, but they had all of this sort of granularity within it. And while it made it for a fantastic simulation of Waterloo and whether or not the muskets had been rested and more accurate for the first firing of the day, it required so much time and bookkeeping that if you weren't there for that type of game, it was practically unplayable for you.
Yeah, I'd say that sort of game's great if that's what you want from gaming. And there are plenty of really good designers out there who get that style of gaming and write great rule sets which have quite a lot of detail in. I mean, I don't think I actually could sit and write a game like that, because it's not the way my brain works really. So it's something I've tried to do is, if there's already a game out there which is working for period in the way that I want, I don't need to write my own game for it. Someone else has done that. They've been through the hassle and the hard work of creating it. So I do play a few more complex games, but I would say that they're fewer in number each year than the simpler pickup games.
Sure. Before we leave Lion Rampant, there was one thing, because I've seen the larger book and obviously more page count, bigger word count, so you could put more in there. The Men Who Would Be Kings. It's a spectacular game, which I have butchered, as anybody who's seen my 4-hour Rourke's Drift epic will know. But it has an AI system in it, Mr. Babbage, his thinking engine. And I almost was surprised that I didn't see an AI in Lions Rampant. Is it because the AI was written specifically for sort of colonial against native troops, and it was easier to dictate movement and maneuver, or was it just you didn't feel it was necessary for Lions Rampant?
I think it comes down to the kind of like the traditions of different periods of gaming. So, by my understanding of colonial wargaming, it's over the years, many games and many gamers have wanted everyone to be on one side fighting against an enemy. Sure. I've seen that less in other periods of warfare. It might well come down to the accounts and perspectives that we have on the period, but also I think you have in the colonial period, especially, it's that kind of firepower versus maneuver system, which I think lends itself quite well to players working on one side. At the moment, I'm trying to come up with a workable game which is set in Sudan in 1884-85, which is a period I'm fascinated by, where all of the players actually play as different Sudanese tribes effectively against a British square. Right. Because usually that although I've said with Mr. Babbage in The Many Wicked Kings that you can use it as either side and actually works better for the natives, I think. Most players I know are playing as a imperial power in the game against the other side. So I'm trying to make a more gameable version of that at the moment. Whether it ever happens or not, I don't know at the moment.
It's one of those things. We'll keep an eye out, and hopefully we'll see it in the future anyway. Moving into Age of Penda, which you've touched on briefly, I was struck when I seen the rule set. This is a game that could be a board game because it plays on a gridded tabletop. And you'd already done something, I was going to say something similar with Age of Battle Ravens, but it's not. Although the fact they both work on boards is probably as close as they come. What was the idea with Age of Penda to move away from measuring tapes and to take that more strategic overview rather than the sort of the nitty-gritty tactical?
I think one of the most off-putting things for new gamers or new war gamers I found is the way that measuring works in the game. So, for example, with non-gaming friends, I've never really had any problems introducing them to board games because you've got kind of defined parameters of areas, and everyone's used to Monopoly or Cluedo or something like that. So you're used to seeing a grid that you move around on. I think one of the barriers to people coming into miniatures gaming, from my experience anyway, is you just feel weird that you're measuring on a table and moving all of the figures, and then if you go a few steps further into more complex games, the angle that you're coming from might actually be quite important. I play quite a lot of DBA, Bellas and Quitatis, and I did that. I mean, I play it in a very friendly, fluffy manner, but I've come up against people that will, maneuver so that the slight angle makes a real difference in the outcome of a combat. Yes. So I wanted to look at how I could avoid all of that in a game, make something nice and simple for people to get started with, but also for what I'm interested in for the early medieval period. I'm not so sure that precise maneuvering mattered that much for those armies. So I've used the grid as kind of like a way of putting units in proximity to each other, and then kind of what they do within the grid doesn't matter really. It's more just it's quite a high level way to look at the game. But you're, as a leader of that army, you're putting your troops in the right area, and then you kind of just assume that they do the right thing. So I've tried to do it to make the game easier to pick up.
I have to say the grid is interesting. I bought some dressmaker's chalk because I plan on playing it out on a 6x4 using 28mm figures, potentially to do some games on the channel in the not too distant future. Okay. I'm currently looking at the best part of 400 Vikings and Irish to do Clon Tarf, because it's
as you do,
as I do anyway, certainly. But for people who are unaware of Age of Penda, apart from the gridded board, you also play with essentially like a battle board that's shared between the two players, where you're essentially bidding for maneuvers and fighting and rallying or shooting, and you have so much resources per side, but everything goes onto the one board, so you can make those big decisions, be it to move somebody or to fight a battle or to shoot. And even if you don't have shooting troops, then that affects your opponent because he can no longer buy the shoot action. And that I absolutely adore, because when you're playing a big game like that, stopping your opponent's plans in their tracks is as much part of the game as making sure that your own plans come through. And it has that action and reaction very simply and beautifully displayed on that one little grid, essentially.
It's really a worker placement mechanism that you see in various different board games. that's something that I love, and I wanted to work out how I could apply that into games about warfare, because I'd never seen that done. A few people have seen it and have said it's like Saga, but I would say it's actually very, very it's just
very
you've got orders on a board, but it works in a very different way. But essentially, it's a worker placement mechanism. So you've kind of got a little mini game to play before you play each turn, and that's what I enjoy. It's the different things appeal to different players. So some miniatures games only really offer you the opportunity to be effectively like a squad or platoon commander, placing your troops and shooting at the targets. Something you see more commonly in board games, but in a few miniatures games as well, is only really offering you the top level of command. So if you look at a kind of old style hex and counter war game, you're maneuvering battalions or regiments into an area, and then you don't worry about what they're actually doing to fight. You just know that they fight. So here I've been trying to combine the two, but also make it into a fun game as well. I like it when you're playing against your opponent and they take the order that you wanted to be taken next, or you think you've been really clever because you've taken something that you've assumed they want, and they're just shrugging their shoulders and didn't want it anyway. So it produces smiles and laughs, and that's my main thing in a game.
And you've got a range of miniatures to go with Age of Penda as well.
So that's Wiggler, which I've been calling them travel size 28s, which I think you've picked up on. Thank you.
A few people in the comment section on what the unboxing actually thought they were 28s until I put the ruler beside them and went, no, here they are, because my God, there's some detail on those figures.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, I studied archaeology and studied specifically the early medieval period in Britain, and I'd never quite found any ranges of figures in the smallest scale that looked how I'd like them to look. In 28mm, I think you're fine. You've got Gripping Beast, you've got Footsore, and probably various others that do a great job of that. But I've not seen that done in the smaller scale. Now I've been speaking to Mark Copplestone, a very, very famous sculptor. I think he used to work for Games Workshop and Citadel, and I'm sure he did some of the earliest 40k figures. But he's been, when I was a kid, he was one of those names that you'd read in White Dwarf magazine. We've been talking about different ideas, and he'd had his own range of 15mm fantasy barbarica figures. They're called. It's a kind of make-believe pre-Roman Britain, and they're lovely figures. He's such a good sculptor. So I decided if ever I was going to do the range, I wanted to do it with Mark. And we talked about it for a long, long time. And then I finally got the chance to launch that. So I describe them as 18mm figures, which seems to have upset some people. But essentially they're 15mm figures, but just the larger size, like many are now. I've tried to describe it. I'm trying to be honest about what they are, because I wouldn't mix them with, say, Essex or minifigs or some of the older true 15mm ranges. They stand probably a head above those. But I kind of wish a little now that I just call them 15mm and let people discover, because that seems to be a point of concern for people. But I love the figures. Mark's sculptor. We've worked on as much historical detail as we can and made what we think are educated guesses about the rest of it. So far, we've covered Anglo-Saxons. I've been doing named leaders from different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
I've noticed,
not because you have to use them as that, but it's just a really nice little touch. And we've tried to make each of them have a little bit of the character of what we know of that particular person. So, for example, Oswald of Northumbria, he has a cross on his shield because he used Christianity as a big part of his popularity. Sexred of Essex is one of my favourites. He features in the Detectorists, if you've seen the TV show about metal detectors. They're trying to find his treasure in the first series of that. But he was a kind of a unreconstructed pagan king of Essex. So we've put him in a big fur cloak, and we've given him a kind of Scandinavian style helmet, because I think that the culture of Scandinavia was kind of very prevalent along the East Coast. So there's loads of little details built into the range, and yeah, I'm really, really pleased with them.
It's fascinating to see that range come together, and it's not the only range that has your name attached to it these days. The Temple of the West have been showcasing their Knights of the Round Table, or rather Daniel Mersey's Knights of the Round Table, which I think are actually going on sale as we film this. They just previewed the painted versions a couple of days ago, and I think they're going to go on sale this week. And that is classic Le Morte d'Arthur, Hollywood style, I suppose, is probably a way to put it. Knights where some of the figures look spectacular and would look historically accurate, but then you have I suppose what you would expect to see Merlin and Arthur look like in a film or a representation of that period, not the late Roman that he probably was, but the more early, middle to late medieval period.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of thinking of this as a bit of a fairy tale range, really. Kyle, who runs Temple of the West, came to me and asked if I'd be interested in working on a range with him. Essentially, his idea was that I did the art direction on it, so I'd choose how the knights would look, kind of armor they were wearing, who we'd include in the range, and so on. And I loved the idea of that. There's only one range of Knights of the Round Table that I've seen before that I thought was great, and that was Tom Meyer's one for Thunderbolt Mountain, which I think they're still available somewhere online, but they're true 25s, so they're kind of dwarfed by everything else, but they're beautiful figures. And I thought, well, if we can do kind of like a modern take on what he was achieving there, so it's fairy tale, legendary Arthur. The knights are wearing a mixture of mail armor with a bit of plate. The heraldry was taken from kind of like the medieval sources for, if you think that different knights had specific coats of arms based on the medieval evidence, then we're using those. And the heraldry is actually sculpted onto the shields, which I wanted to do, because if you're going to have, say, a Lancelot or a Galahad, I want there to be something about that figure which actually identifies them as such. So I also, for me, that makes it easier to paint as well, because I've got some guidelines there. But the range looks really, really good. I've got some painted figures, and they're amazing. I think we have maybe 7 or 8 packs, I think, are going to be released to begin with, which will feature obviously Arthur and members of the court, so Guinevere and Merlin and so on. Lady of the Lake's in there. I
really like the Lady of the Lake.
It's a lovely figure.
The veil on and just carrying Excalibur forward.
But we're also including things like there's going to be a pack of ruffians who look, they're medieval peasants essentially, but there's a little more to them to make them have a bit of an outlaw look. And then we're including kind of some of the villains of the piece as well. So some of the knights who fought against the Round Table, various wizards, witches, things like that, and a few creatures and giants as well. So it's just, we've had real fun with it, and it's been lovely for me to kind of, I've written about the legendary Arthur so much over the years, not so much in gaming, but just in my other life. I've written about legendary Arthur quite a bit, and so it's nice to get really hands-on with a range of figures and to say, we want this one to be wearing this helmet, or have that kind of pose. So that's great, and I'm looking forward to them coming out.
I'm looking forward to seeing Mordred down the line then as well.
Yeah, he's in there. He will be there.
I'm sure he wouldn't be far away. One of the main features, I think, that's certainly come through for me in this little chat is how much the research and the history comes through into your games. And I have a couple of the Wargaming or the Wargamers Guide books, which are fascinating because they aren't rule sets, but they are books that you can use to help you into a period with like a potted history of tactics, armor, how equipment was used, major battles, rule sets that you might want to use down the line. These are a great way into a specific period for some people. And then I also noticed that you became the game designer in residence at Edinburgh University as well of late. So how much of the gaming as a tool for teaching do you think that, let me think how best to word this. Do you think the game should take prevalence, or would you have a very hard line and go, well, historically, it doesn't make sense to do that because they wouldn't have done that, and therefore the history side sort of rises above the game side when you're designing or when you're helping other people explore game design?
Yeah, I see what you get to that. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, before I work on any game, I do a lot of historical research. But then rather than using all of that historical research to make sure that absolutely everything is in the game, I kind of try to find kind of like the characteristics that I feel are most typical of that period of warfare and put those into the game. So I'll do as much reading as I can on a period. To be honest, most of the rules that I've written are for periods that I've studied for years, so I kind of already know where I think I need to go with it. But once I've refreshed myself, I'll go through and make a big list of everything that I think is really characteristic of warfare in that period, then think about how I can use that in a game without the game getting bogged down by individual details. So my aim is to produce something. Primarily, I'm a game designer, not a historian. I was never a historian. I've read that I was, but I was an archaeologist. But I'm a game designer now. So I want to create something which plays well, but at the same time, there's no point in creating a game about a historical period if when you play it, there's absolutely nothing that suggests the period to me.
Sure.
Now, other people can decide for themselves whether I've judged that correctly, or whether if they're playing one of my games, they might not feel that it works for the period, and that's fine, because everyone kind of interprets sources differently. But yeah, for me, there's got to be an underlying feel to the game, which makes it feel like you're playing a game in, say, medieval Europe or 19th century Africa, or wherever it is. I want the game to have at least some feel of that. Now, using it as a historical learning tool, the way that I personally think of these things is where I've been able to help people is kind of creating a source book material. So you've mentioned the Pen and Sword series that I worked on, and earlier on I mentioned Glutter of Ravens, which was the Arthurian source book. So there I'm trying to present as much pertinent historical information as I can for gamers, so they can then go away and with a feel for the period and find the right set of rules for themselves, whether it's mine or someone else's, doesn't really matter. But I'd like people to feel like they're making a educated choice in what they're going for. And that's really what we've done in the University of Edinburgh, where I was the game designer in residence, which was a really fun thing to do, essentially working with the lecturers and students to essentially gamify their research. We've taken the research of far cleverer historians and researchers than I am. They've kind of shown me what they have. I've then looked at ways of working with them to gamify that. So, for example, we've just done the Satsuma Rebellion book, and that was a student's dissertation about the Satsuma Rebellion. Now, they were also a gamer and were really interested in a way of using all of that research to help other gamers, rather like I had with Gutter Ravens back in the day.
Yeah.
So we then worked together on presenting lots of source material, including down to things like uniforms, which isn't always easy to find out about.
Yeah.
Then presented special rules for the men who would be kings, and also some scenarios. So that's, I think, quite a lot of historical feel in games comes from immersing yourself in the historical period, and then you find the details within the game, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I talked to Dr. Gianluca at Salute 2018. I think it was but they hadn't even published the Crusades at that point. They were just bringing it around and showing it off. But the big thing for them was being able to add that historical context and I suppose to build a focus on a specific period in such a way that you could both game and teach with that. And yeah, it's fascinating to see and interesting that the university took that inspiration and direction as well. It'd be nice to see other establishments, whether universities, colleges, or what have you, sort of broaden the horizons, because it's great to see. I'm going to call them youngsters, getting into
young
people, youth of today, getting into gaming via history, or alternatively getting into history via gaming. They're both subjects that I'm fascinated by myself. So it's nice to see that, and even if it's just for that period when they're at university or at college, if it doesn't come any further, there's still a resource then for years to come for other people to make best use of. So yeah, it's a lovely synergy there, I suppose.
I got a lot out of doing it because it felt really nice to introduce students and academics to other things that they could do with their research, and kind of it's not just the books we've worked on. We ran a couple of game jams as well, where people would turn up, come up with some ideas of games they would like to make, and then we talked about how you could do that. Now, whether anything will come of those, I don't know, but it was really enlightening to see people who had so much source material at their fingertips that they just knew, kind of suddenly having that light bulb moment where you no longer need to just do something written as, say, an academic paper, but you could be effectively educating through games as well. I think there are a couple of other universities that run similar schemes. I don't know that much about them. I think I've read about one or two other universities that are doing a similar thing, and it's great, because also for especially historical war gamers, you think about the amount of research that they actually do. There's a lot of knowledge out there, but also if historians understand what gamers are interested in, like we had many discussions about what information they had which was relevant to a game, and other stuff which was kind of nice to know. But actually, if you're writing a book for a war gamer, actually they don't need to know that information. It's good that it's known about and has been researched, but that's not something that's going to be used in a game. So it's just another way for people to use their research and just get enjoyment from what they know and what they're doing.
Fascinating stuff. Before I let you go, I think we should really touch on the future, because people are always curious as to what designers are getting up to. I see you're taking a more fantastical approach with the next game, which is Xenos Rampant. I can't imagine that there's too much historical accuracy going to be pushed into that one.
We've got lots of films to base
in that case,
so that's the historical documents source material there, and I've had plenty of fun researching that, watching lots of old sci-fi films. But yeah, I mean, this one is it's going to be another hardback book, and I think it comes out in November. Essentially, this was, I mean, over the years, I've had lots of different gamers enthusiastically contact me to say they've got a great idea for another book in the series.
Yeah.
And quite often I look at them and there's some really good stuff in there, but effectively it's an adaptation of one of the games that already exists. So I suggest maybe submit it as a magazine article or write it up and share it online so other people can see your ideas. But I wouldn't feel comfortable putting out as a new book because it's essentially the same as
it's an iteration.
Another one with a few different ideas. So those variants are great. And probably the most common one that people contacted me about was a sci-fi version. And all of those kind of fell into that same category of there's some really nice ideas in there. But I always had it in my mind, if there was going to be a science fiction version of it, it had to be just perfect from my point of view. So Richard, who's the co-author on Xenos Rampant, had written his own Xenos Rampant variation of Dragon Rampant, the fantasy game, and that was published online. And I think someone sent it to me rather than Richard sending it, but someone sent me a link to it, and I looked and I thought, actually, there's a lot in here that I really like that I've not seen before, and that kind of says science fiction gaming, and it looks to be fun without adding too much complexity as well, which is always really important in any adaptations of my games. So we got in touch and we then worked together on basically refining his variant adaptation rules into being a standalone game. So I think there's still a version of Xenos Rampant somewhere online that people can download, but that's actually not the same as the final game is going to be. There are various different changes with kind of my input as well. It's essentially Richard's baby in terms of creating a science fiction version of the Rampant series, but with my input to kind of bring it more in line with what I'd like to see and make it work well alongside the other games. So as with all of the games in that series, there's going to be bits in there that you are already familiar with, but hopefully I feel that it plays in a very different way. I mean, it's essentially a game about firefights, and really none of the other games in the series have quite tackled that level of kind of heavy firepower between two different sides. So I mean, and again, the book, it looks great. I've seen the final laid out proofs of it, and it's a really nice looking book. It was a good chance for me to get out some of my really old Space Lords figures, which I had some of when I was a kid in the late 80s. So as with all of my games, and especially like the fantasy and sci-fi stuff, there's an element of tongue-in-cheek retro to it as well. I'd like it if people can discover their old figures and pull them out again and start using them.
I was going to say, will there be bonus points for using figures from the 70s and 80s? Because there is a fantasy list in Lion Rampant as well that gives you a couple of additional renown for pulling out figures from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that came from the Dragon Rampant fantasy rules, because I love 70s and 80s figures. I mean, they're very crude by modern standards, but there's a real charm there. What I started with, and I still really enjoy collecting them. So no, there's no rule like that in Xenos Rampant, but there's nothing to stop you I've writing it in your own book and saying it's there.
I've got a biro. I can put that in if I need to. It's exciting times ahead for fans of Rampant, whether you're Dragon, Lion, or indeed Xenos as well. And it's been an absolute pleasure to take the time to sit down and have a chat with you today, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really nice just to chat through games for a while. It's always a fun thing to do, and I probably don't do it as much as I should.
There you go, folks. Hope you enjoy that. If you have any questions that you might want us to pass on to Daniel, pop them below. Or if people are looking to get in contact with you, do you do any of that social media thing that the youth get up to?
You can find me on Instagram, which it's not exclusively about my upcoming games. It's all gaming. You won't see photos of my dinner, for example, but you're as likely to see the latest game I've been working on or the latest figure that I've painted. But I'm Mr. Daniel's Games Emporium on Instagram.
There you go. We'll pop that in the link below. And until next time, folks, take care.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.